Big Boy, a name synonymous with American railroading. One of the last giant articulated steam locomotives to be built, the 25-strong fleet defined Union Pacific's desire to move lots of freight at speed during the Second World War. Their reputation became the stuff of legends, with the name becoming one of the most famous locomotive classes in the world. It's no wonder that interest in the 4000 surged when 4014 re-entered service for Union Pacific steam excursions in 2019. Their interest in the classes led to countless models being made for various model railroad gauges. One desire LEGO fans have is wanting to see a brick-built version of the world's largest currently operating steam locomotive. Some models on the market are stunningly faithful recreations at a very stiff price tag, while more affordable models are, how can I put this? Crude, to put it nicely. One model by MorningStrummer seemed to hit all the right notes on rebrickable, with an option to buy the set from a Chinese company called LetBricks. I was musing over the idea of reviewing this set when LetBricks reached out to me and offered to send me a copy of this new set. I quickly agreed and waited patiently to see what I was in store for. When the package arrived, it looked like any other box I'd received from China, but I was very surprised to see the custom box that was inside. Normally when I receive these orders, there's nothing under the bubble wrap, it's just bricks. But this time, the actual box had complete art. The box art showed a roster angle of the Big Boy similar to Revell's long-standing HO kit, and the side of the box featured photos of the electronics and a side profile of the Big Boy. The bottom of the box included a small blurb about the LetBricks presence on social media. Opening the box, I found the decal sheet and a lot of tightly packed bags. The Jagao electronics seemed to be remakes of the defunct Power Functions line from LEGO, with a rechargeable battery box, infrared receiver, twin L motors, lights, and 2 different extension cords. One bag contained the necessary hose pieces cut to the rough lengths that you need for the mock. One thing absent from the box was printed instructions, replaced instead by a USB flash drive containing a PDF of the instructions. Such as the times where a USB is cheaper than a printed instruction sheet, but that doesn't matter. Any seasoned LEGO builder who's used digital instructions knows the struggle of clicking around their model and trying to figure out how they built it without any digital instructions. While I was sorting bricks, I wondered, who is this LetBrick company? I had not heard of them, and upon further research, found out that they're one of the more legitimate alternative brick companies out there. They're a group of brick fans who want to partner with creators to make their mocks into ready-to-build sets. LetBricks sources parts from Wong, Kata Block, Xingbao, Qman, Kazi, Linus, Winner, and Sembo. The quality of the bricks was acceptable, with 1 or 2 defects, and we're talking small strings of plastic on the brick that were just coming off of the mold, and some speckles of white that was easily brushed off on another. Now, coming from 7 different manufacturers, I did not notice a difference in the quality, nor was I able to distinguish who made what. But when you purchase from LetBrick, the creator receives a commission on the model, so they are compensated. In a world of stolen designs, this was refreshing to hear. After about 6 hours or so of sorting all 3,200 pieces, I ran out of desk space and had to place my Technic parts on a baking sheet just to have the room. The chaotic look of all the parts was intimidating, and doubts began to sink in as I opened up the instructions and started the build. The tender was up first, at a deceptively small 33 steps. In reality, this was like math homework, with colored arrows pointing out the order of what to build on each instruction. The bricks went together as well as LEGO, and did not feel too loose or too stiff. Now, the classic texture of a pure LEGO brick was slightly different, but this is not an issue for most people, including myself. The interior structure of the tender consisted of a Lionel Trains palette of orange, blue, and white, while the black exterior took shape. I was skeptical of the strength of the structure, but it grew sturdier as it progressed. The roof of the tender features a removable section for the rechargeable battery box, which is housed where the oil tank is. If you want a model of the Big Boy that is not 4014, this will have to be changed to a coal bunker, as the oil bunker was only fitted for excursion duties, but in service was trialed on 4023, albeit briefly. The front bogie came together in a fashion I grew to expect from any mock. While it seemed a little flimsy, it was on par from any other design, so I wasn't bothered. Now, the rear centipede portion has a rigid 5 sets of wheels together, and yet it is built to take the standard LEGO 40 stud radius curve. The genius of this design is shown here, as 3 of the 5 wheel sets have lateral play and do not lock together thanks to the exterior detail. For any serious LEGO modeler building a centipede tender, this bogie design should be the standard going forward. After gushing about the design of the bogies, the sides went together with little fanfare. While not outlined in the instructions, I fitted the Union Pacific stickers, closing out the centipede tender. The tender came together in about 3 hours, and I called it for the night. The locomotive's construction started out with the rear set of drivers. This part of the build used exclusively Technic pieces to house the drivers and the gearing. This was by far the most complex part of the build, where you had to ensure the axles were lined up perfectly before sealing them into the mechanism. One unique design choice that surprised me was the decision to house the L motor on the driver sets rather than being tucked away in the boiler. The light gray motor was hidden surprisingly well when the bricks came into play for building the cylinders. I was relieved to see that the instructions did mention to quarter the drivers, something a lot of LEGO models neglect to mention. For those unaware, quartering means rotating the wheels on one side by 90 degrees to ensure a good rotational thrust and help the wheels move smoothly. There is more to be said about the side rods on this build, but I'll save that for when we talk about performance. After building the rear set of drivers, I noticed the motor was so heavy it tipped the wheel set, but this was rectified in the next step, which built out the frame over the trailing truck. This particular portion contains a lot of undercab details and a little nicely detailed trailing truck. The front wheel set shares similarities with the rear one, specifically over the drivers, but takes on a longer form by the cylinders to account for the piston stroke over the pony truck. The pony truck is connected by a series of 1x2 lift arms that allow for lateral movement that doesn't jut out over the rods. This in turn is connected by a longer lift arm to the front wheel set of the pony truck, which connects the pilot. The plow includes a removable section to hide the coupler, but I opted to keep mine in the open position. The first use of wires came when setting up the headlight, and to my dismay, the light piece was smaller in the stud-sized hole, making it nearly impossible to have it stay in place. With all the wheels completed, my Technic parts were almost gone, but I had to make room for the massive frame on my desk. The wheel sets were by far the hardest part of the build, and I felt like I had tackled a major hill. And with that optimism, it was time to attack the boiler. The first part of the boiler was the underside, built upside down and connected via snot to the first vertical structure by the smoke box. This part was simple enough to follow, and it culminated in bringing the front and wheel sets together. This was about 6 hours straight of a build when I decided to call it for the second day of building. For those keeping track, I'm about 9 hours in, with just the underframe and the tender completed. With the first weekend over, and the work week beginning, my build time would become more limited, but I still wanted to complete this project as soon as possible. I attempted to make a decent attack on the boiler in the evening, but I noticed that my wires were not lining up with the infrared receiver. The wires on the rear wheel set were not long enough to wrap around. As a result, I had to dismantle what I had done so far to rework the wiring. I checked ahead in the instructions to make sure I had enough room, and I had to reverse the position of the receiver. The rear wheel set's cord was now positioned to run up the same hole as the front driver's Technic rod wire and light wire. The motors were consolidated to a 30cm extension wire, and the light had just enough slack to make it to the IR receiver. After getting batteries on Tuesday, the smoke box and the assembly of the boiler began to take shape. The smoke box section was a straightforward build, with 1x2 Technic bricks on the underside for assembly of the steam pipe, and essential for articulated steam locomotives. This allows the transfer of steam used in the rear set of cylinders to the front and then out the stack. On the model, the front set of steam pipes sit nicely into the grooves laid out in the front cylinders. When fitting the sides of the boiler structure, this particular section is angled to reflect the shape of the big boy's boiler. I was impressed with how sturdy this section held on. The last step was fitting 4014 smokebox door, number boards, and bell. The locomotive finally had a face. Wednesday started off by assembling the double smokestack and whistle to be fitted on the smokebox. I paused to apply the big boy lettering as close to where I had seen it written on 4014 in West Chicago and the headlight numbers. After that, the front sand dome, steam dome, and safety valves were assembled on top of the boiler, and the front half of the locomotive was complete. The directions turned toward the cab, and a tricky assembly with studs on side bricks forming the base of the structure. I was concerned as this step resulted in a very flimsy design, but the cab sides helped firm it up when it was put into place. One revision I made while building was choosing not to snake the wire out through the cab area, but rather have it dip under so it had a better appearance. You can do this either way, but I prefer not to have my wire sticking out through the cab. The last step I achieved for that night was assembling the engineer's side of the firebox which included the hoses to build the reverser. The final push focused on the fireman's side of the firebox. Apart from the piping, the assembly was essentially the same. The rear sand dome came into place nicely, with a 2x2 hole for the receiver to be exposed. The cab roof gave some more sturdiness to the design and brought a sense of closure to the model. The last step was to apply the 1x6 tiles vertically to the cab, locking that section together. In total, I'd spent 16 hours building this Union Pacific big boy. Before showing off the model in full, I want to address the wrong font that was delivered on LetBricks' product. TrainBricks, who makes 3D custom printed side rods, sells a sticker pack that uses the right Futura font on all Union Pacific locomotives since the 1930s. The rear of the tender had UP 4014 applied, the numbers on the cab side replaced, and the shield logo placed on the front of 4014. The result is a better looking model, but I'm a stickler for details, so if this doesn't bother you, don't worry about it. I asked a few LEGO model railroader friends what they thought about the look of the final product. The general consensus was the model looked the part, but it does have some funky proportions. This is where the debate of scale comes in, as this model is advertised as 138, which correlates to a 10-stud wide model. By purely going with this scale, or even the more common 148 8-wide scale, extra large driver sizes would have been a better fit. As a result, the locomotive does look a little more squat than it should, yet all the key features are there. When I placed my own minifigure next to the driver's, he stood at about the same height as a standard L driver. Now, I'm 5'11", and comparing myself to the 69-inch drivers, it looked the part. Now, the boiler is not a straight line and contours like the real thing, and the Technic and Flex hose pipe work along the side is sturdily held in. Looking at the locomotive, the only complaint I have is that I'm not a personal fan of the open window looking out at the boiler. I would prefer to have a clear tile here, but this is an issue that can be rectified with spare parts. The only other nitpicks I have with the model concern the smoke box, specifically the color design and the bricks. The number board's 1x2 tiles should be black, not gray. Now, I understand this designer created a model off of his own Rebel Big Boy kit and that's how he painted it, but a little more research could have corrected this. Thankfully, I had some spare 1x2 tiles of black and easily made the swap. The tender, in theory, suffers from the same proportional issues as the locomotive, but it does look the part. The oil bunker can easily be removed to access the rechargeable battery box without compromising any structural integrity. One gripe that I hold concerns the back end, which is simply comical to an American. The tender looks like it has buffers and 3 rear lamps. In reality, the small indents on the tender are for pulls to shove cars on adjacent tracks, and the 2 lamp spots were for the rear markers, seldom used on the big boys. These are easy fixes, but they add to the quirk of the model. For the more casual LEGO train enthusiasts, these buffers will look a little silly, but fit any regular rolling stock LEGO has offered with buffers, and it'll look just fine. The last upgrade I want to touch on is the wheels and side rods of the locomotive. The standard spoked LEGO wheels are not correct for the big boy, that use a box pot design. To the average LEGO train fan, this may not be an issue, but to a more nitpicky modeler, this is a glaring problem. I fixed this issue by purchasing 3D printed wheels in white and spray painting them black to save money. The 3D printed side rods helped round out the look. Overall, the locomotive's design has some minor drawbacks, but to the average enthusiast, this is a compromise between the cheap, terribly designed model and the expensive, accurate ones. I feel it captures the look of the big boy quite well and has the right feel to it. But looks are only half the battle. How does it perform? Before running the big boy, we need to hook up the locomotive and the tender. The Technic bar drops into the front bogie on the tender, and the wire has to be snaked through a hole in the battery box. Make sure you leave a good amount of slack for the wire to extend and contract when the locomotive is taking curves. I'm not a fan of how the wire sticks out the top of the tender, and I feel this could be better hidden by having it come out near the drawbar. Out of the gate, 4014 slowly crept to life, with a slower than expected top speed. I had not fully charged the battery box, so I assumed this was the case as I put it through its paces. I set up an oval with a 72 stud radius by TrickBricks. The locomotive leaned into these curves with no issues, and the articulation on the tender worked great on the road. The big boy had no issues at all taking the radius 104 switch by brick tracks to couple onto its train, a Brickmania flat car with Jeep crates, and the 2021 Brick Train Awards winning caboose. When setting off the train, I noticed no struggle or slip from the locomotive at all. But this was a very light train compared to what big boys would march over Sherman Hill. One crazy design feature of the Big Boy was that it was designed to handle the tight R40 radius curves, standard for LEGO. While the original promotional video showed how his Big Boy handled it, I had my doubts, and something that big on a switch so tight would look ridiculous. But like any large steam locomotive, it took the turnout like a champ, with the boiler and cab protruding out well from the front of the driver's set and pilot wheels. For anyone wanting to run their Big Boy, I recommend bigger curves just to keep things flowing nicely and not strain the motors too much. LetBricks Big Boy is a welcome sight on the brick-built market. The Union Pacific Big Boy is one of the most iconic steam locomotives in the world, and a desirable item to have among modelers of any scale. A perfect model will cost you an arm and a leg, but some models miss the mark of the Big Boy entirely, while this one looks and performs decently enough to make any LEGO train fan happy. The build is long and challenging, but the end result is more than worth it. I want to thank LetBricks for mailing me this fine model, and if you want to try your hand at building your own, go to letbricks.com and use code LTMOCK to save 12% on your purchase. I've also included the link to the rebrickable instructions to those who want to use pure LEGO parts. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to see more Railfan and LEGO Train content.